Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today we're going to be talking about Paladin in Shadowbringers. Now, Paladin is one of the jobs that I actually don't really play all that much, and that is mainly coming from Stormblood. Back in Stormblood, I didn't really like Paladin all that much. It has a magical damage part in its rotation, which back in Stormblood also had cast times accompanying it, and I didn't really feel like cast times really belonged on a tank, because of course, as a tank, you need to move around. You still have your off-global cooldowns that you have to be using for your damage rotation, and you also have off-global cooldowns that you need to weave for defensive mitigation, and because of the cast times that were there, it didn't really feel all that great, so that is why I didn't really play Paladin all that much back in Stormblood. Now, going into Shadowbringers, they did change this whenever you are under the effect of FFXIV, which is your magical damage buff, or actually, technically it's just magical potency buff, because this also works on your heal and such, but basically, whenever this buff is now active, you don't get cast times anymore. So it's pretty much fixed the one complaint, or the one minor complaint that I have about Paladin back in Stormblood. So Paladin right now feels pretty good to play. Now, as I mentioned, they have a magical damage part in their rotation, making them pretty unique in the sense that the other tanks don't really have this. So whenever you have that FFXIV buff active, you can actually, if you want to, disengage from the boss. Now, of course, if you disengage, you do lose your auto attacks, which are a big source of damage for you, so you don't really want to do this. But if there is going to be downtime in certain fights that you are going to guaranteed lose some uptime for, if it is possible to align FFXIV with that part of the fight, then you're actually going to be able to do damage, or at least more damage, where the other tanks would not be able to do so, which makes Paladin actually a really cool tank when it comes down to optimization, because you don't do a specific rotation depending on what is just more efficient or like more damage, depending on aligning with raid buffs, but you actually want to kind of fix your rotation towards what the boss is going to be doing, so that your FFXIV is able to line up with, for example, the downtime, where you might not be able to hit the boss physically and would just be like shield lobbing with your ranged attack or something like that. Some really cool optimization that can be done. Of course, if you're looking at it as just a general play of Paladin, it's also a very straightforward job, which is why I think Paladin is probably one of the better tanks to start off on if you're just getting into tanking, because it is a very straightforward, a very simple job to learn how to play. However, it's not because the job is relatively simple to get into that there isn't any cool optimization stuff that you can do at endgame, because I think when it comes down to optimizing fights, as I said, optimizing around disengages with that FFXIV, there's actually a lot of cool things that you can do. Now, when it comes down to Paladin as a tank, they're also very different from the other three tanks. When we look at the other three tanks, they have an extra personal mitigative cooldown that Paladin does not have, and I like to refer to it as their unique mitigation. If you look at Warrior, they have Thrill of Battle, Dark Knight has Dark Mind, and Gunbreaker has Camouflage, but Paladin doesn't have anything like that. But to make up for that, Paladin has extra party mitigation that the rest of the tanks do not. So when we look at Warrior, they have Shake It Off, which is a shield, and then Dark Knight and Gunbreaker have their percentage mitigation in Heart of Light and Dark Missionary. But when we look at Paladin, they actually have both a shield as well as a percentage mitigation. They have Divine Veiled, which is the shield, and then they have Passage of Arms, which is the percentage mitigation. It's a little bit annoying to use because Divine Veil requires you to be healed, and Passage of Arms also requires the party to quite literally stand behind you for it to take effect. So it's not as user-friendly as, for example, the other tank's mitigation, but you do have extra mitigation available to you for certain fights where there is heavy mitigation necessary. For example, this is great when you're doing, let's say, Golden Bahamut in UCOB, because in that fight, or at least in that portion of that fight, you need a lot of different mitigation, and the tanks that are in Paladin are only able to bring one of them, whereas Paladin can bring two, which is just a great addition for sure. Not only when it comes down to party mitigation, like party white mitigation, but also when it comes down to main tank mitigation when you are in the off tank role. When we look at the other three tanks, they only have one thing that they can give to the main tank whilst they are the off tank, whereas Paladin can do two things. They either have intervention, which is kind of like the normal thing you would be using, but you also have cover, which is going to make it so that you take the damage that was intended for the person that you are covering. Now, the problem with cover is that in Shadowbringers it got nerfed quite heavily, not only making it so that there is a gauge cost attached to this skill, which it didn't before, and it also doesn't have the actual mitigation built in anymore. Back in Stormblood, and I believe in Heavensward as well, when you would cover a person, you would already take 20% less damage, so it was really good to just use as a cooldown itself, not requiring you to tank so. But right now, it doesn't have the damage mitigation part attached to it anymore, and it's also going to be costing you off gauge, which is something that you would would much rather spend on something else, meaning that cover right now isn't really all that useful. But if it ever was to be buffed, like having mitigation attached to it again, I think that this would definitely be a really good skill again as well. Right now, not so useful, because of course you can just tank swap and then use that gauge on a Sheltron instead, which I think is much better gauge spendage than using it on a cover itself. Of course, cover can still be used on, for example, a DPS that might be low HP or something to save them right as they get rest into a raid wide AoE or something like that. So it's definitely not completely useless, it just doesn't have as many usages as it did back then. Last but not least, we also still have Clemency. This is a heal that Paladin can quite literally spam until they run out of mana, which is quite potent as well. And this heal will also be buffed when you're under the magical effect of Requiescat, because Requiescat buffs all your magical potencies, also including your heal. Now, of course, you don't really want to be using Clemency that much. It breaks your combo, it will also reduce your mana, which you need your mana to be high when you go into that Requiescat window, because to activate the damage portion and the like the no cost times of Requiescat, you need your mana to be quite high. So using your Clemency outside of Requiescat is not that great, because as I mentioned, breaks your combo, will also reduce your mana, so you might not get the effect of Requiescat itself. Inside of Requiescat, it's not that bad to use because it is a very strong heal, and you also don't really like lose your combos and that kind of stuff, but still, it is something that you don't generally want to resort to, and it's more of a last resort when, for example, the healer dies and you need to keep yourself alive for a little bit while, for example, the summoner is trying to res them or something like that. So Clemency, it is there, it is a very powerful tool, but in general you don't really want to be using it, as this is a very big detriment to your personal damage output. Again, if an emergency situation was to arise, then it's definitely something that you can use to keep yourself alive until the healer can resume its job. So when it comes down to the damage rotation of Paladin, then let's talk about that one now. It's very simple and straightforward, as I said before. Of course, there is some optimization stuff that you can do around like disengaged from the boss and all of that kind of stuff, but when it comes down to just playing Paladin at a basic level, it is fairly simple. So we have two damage buffs that we are going to be working with. We have Fight or Flight, which is going to be buffing our physical damage, and we have Requiescat, which is going to be buffing our magical damage. And we have kind of a 60-second loop. Well, technically it's 62 seconds, but we'll just say 60 seconds for the sake of it. So we usually start in our Fight or Flight damage phase, which is going to be, as I said, buffing our physical damage, during which we are going to be using our two physical damage combos, which are Goring Blade, which is a damage over time ability. Then we have our Royal Authority, which is just a straight up damage buff. And then we have Atonements, which is kind of like the Fell Cleave of Paladin, I guess you could say. Then when we go into our magical damage buff, Requiescat, that is where we are going to quite literally be spamming Holy Spirit. This is our magical damage attack. And then we also have a phase finisher in that of Confiteor, which we like to refer to as Confetti in my static. Which is basically going to be an AoE ability that does a bunch of damage. It's really a very strong combo finisher. You can kind of look at this as the inner chaos of Warrior, I guess you could say. And then once those two damage buffs are done, we can basically go back into just doing physical damage with that Goring Blade, the Royal Authority, and the Atonements. And then once we've done that, we basically go back into our Fight or Flight window and start that 1 minute cycle all over again. So relatively simple right there. Now, when it comes down to our combo actions with our GCDs, it's very straightforward as well. We have two combo starters, which are basically going to be our Fast Blade into Riot Blade, which is also going to be giving us some MP because we need mana for when we go into our magical damage phase. And then we basically choose, do I want to reapply my dot? We use Goring Blade. Do I want to just do damage? Do that Royal Authority. And those are your two combos that you're going to be using. Now, when you use Royal Authority, you're also going to be getting 3 stacks of Sword Oath, and that is basically what we are going to be needing if we want to be using those Atonements. As I said, Atonements kind of like the Fell Cleave of Paladin. Whenever you have Sword Oath stacks, you can use Atonement, and that basically makes it fit in its rotation. So we apply our Goring Blade, and then we have 6 GCDs that we can spend on something else, meaning that we're going to do a 1-2-3 combo again, which is that Royal Authority combo. Then we get 3 stacks of Sword Oath, which are then going to translate into 3 Atonement stacks, and then we just reapply our Goring Blade again. Then once we've done that, we go into a Requiescat, which is going to be 4 Holy Spirits into a Confiteor, which is going to be 5 GCDs, but still after that we're going to be needing to reapply our Goring Blade again. Reapply the Goring Blade, do another Royal Authority, another 3 atonements, and then reapply Goring Blade again, and at that point your fight or flight buff will come back as well. So that's kind of how the GCD rotation is going to be. Reapply Goring Blade by activating your fight or flight as well at the start, Royal Authority, atonements, Goring Blade again right before that fight or flight buff runs out. Go into Requiescat, spam some Holy Spirits, finish it off with your Confiteor, Goring Blade reapplication again to make sure that that thing stays applied to the boss, another Royal Authority combo, another 3 atonements, and then when you go to reapply Goring Blade one final time, that is where your fight or flight buff will come up again, and you basically repeat the rotation from there. So relatively straightforward stuff when it comes down to its looping rotation. Now, last but not least, we still have some off-global cooldowns to talk about, of course, when it comes down to our damage rotation, which is going to be Spirits Within, is our single target buff. Now, very important to note about this one is that it delivers a potency depending on how much HP that you have. So it's only a 100 potency attack if you just use it whenever you're low on HP, but it can increase up to 370 potency as your HP gets higher and higher, and this will also restore MP. Because of this, it's much better that Paladin is usually going to be in the off-tank position, because of course as the main tank you're usually not going to be at maximum HP, so to buffer the damage of your Spirits Within, it's usually better to be the off-tank. Also to make use of all of the other mitigation that you have as Paladin, like for example needing to stand with your back turned to the party for that passage of arms, or for example to use the cover, or some other things that Paladin has access to. It's usually better for Paladin to play in the off-tank role when you go into party like content, for example. So you can still totally main tank as Paladin if you want to do so. I personally feel like it is much better suited to the off-tank role though. Then, another of global cooldown, we have a Circle of Scorn, which is a damage over time AoE ability, so pretty good to use, just use it on cooldown pretty much. And then last but not least, we have Intervene. This is our gap closer, stacks up to 2 times, which is just really convenient to use either as a gap closer, or you can just save it up because it will line up with your fight or flight buff. It is physical damage, so you can basically use 2 of those stacks during the fight or flight window for maximum damage, or of course you can just save one for when you need it for the actual gap closer. Now, last but not least, we also have one special GCD that I still want to talk about, which is Shield Bash. Now, this is a GCD that has an innate stun attached to it, and this is something that you technically aren't really going to be using ever, but there are some very minor places where this actually has some usages, like for example the ad phase in Shiva. If for example you were to mess up your stun, or you see that you just barely don't have enough damage to kill the Aqua ad or something right before it goes into the pillar in the middle, you can take out Shield Bash and just stun that ad again. It is the only job in the game, I believe, that has a spammable stun effect. So it is pretty useful in those scenarios. Generally, you don't want to really be using it because it barely does any damage, it breaks your combos, all of that bad stuff. But in those scenarios where you just need a stun, for example, if you're doing open world content and the boss is doing some attack that needs to be stunned, your stun is on cooldown, nobody else is doing it, you can just use Shield Bash to at least still stun that enemy, which can be quite useful in certain scenarios. As I said, you're generally not really going to be using it that much, but it is there in certain cases when you need to use it. For example, Palace of the Dead, Heaven or High might be another place where it could come in quite useful to stomp some dangerous attacks from enemies, where other tanks or other jobs just don't have access to this. So Paladin, pretty cool job, pretty simple job as well when you're first getting into it. Definitely my go-to tank if people were to ask me what should I play when I'm just getting into tanking and I want to learn the role or something like that. I think Paladin is just perfect for that. And even at endgame, Paladin is still very strong. Just because it has a relatively simple rotation doesn't mean that it is boring to play either, because as mentioned, there is some really cool optimization stuff that you can do. And yeah, Paladin is basically just a pretty good job. So let me know what you think of Paladin in the comments down below. I'm glad to read all of them, of course, as always. But that's gonna be it for me. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.